Thanks very much, Vincent. I was quietly working away for 35 years doing my work until I was prompted by a friend to publish the 2 articles I had shown her. She told me I had a moral responsibility to publish them. And now, apart from dealing with the fallout from having challenged the Department of Finance, I also have to deal with the stigma of being a consultant following Michael Gallagher's castigation of consultants last night, but I'm sure I'll cope with it. Given the topic and given the reputation of this conference, it is really a great honour and a privilege, and I'm delighted to be here and share my thoughts with you. It's also an opportunity. I spent about 6 years in a monastery as a young man, aspiring to be a priest, and I never made it, but I have always wanted to give a sermon, and this is my big break. So, about 15 years ago, I spent a week in a hotel down in County Tipperary with 35 Catholic bishops and a cardinal, wrestling with the problems of the church. And we were making very little progress during the week. It was very frustrating. And around about the Thursday afternoon of the week, over coffee, one of the bishops said to me quietly, he said, "You know, of course, you can't pour new wine into old wineskins." And I asked him what did he mean by that, and he said, "You will never get reform through us, through our structures and through us who are at the root of the problem. So you cannot put new wine into old wineskins." So last year, when NESC produced its study, a brilliant study if you haven't read it, Ireland's 5-part crisis, the need for an integrated response, there you have the 5 crises. I was recalling the bishop's words, and I wrote to NESC suggesting a 6th chapter, and that was Ireland's 6th crisis, the culture of the old wineskins, in order to make the point that whatever the substantive issue is, including the issues you'll deal with here in Glenties this week, doesn't matter what the topic is, in each and every case, it's imperative to name and render discussable what in my business we would call the implementation gap, but particularly the culture and the mindset of the old wineskins who received the reports. And you can add to your own list of the wineskins, because it's the political parties, the partnership process, for example, which has been totally incapable of dealing with the reports and the evidence emerging, the Department of Finance, trade unions, the legal profession, the church, and so on. So you've got to address that meta issue of the institution that receives the response, the reports, and the response to that. So here's my list. You can add your own list to those the old wineskins. Now, the textbook on institutional reform, which I would have learned way back early in my career studying in America, there you have it. You carry out an inquiry, judicial inquiry, a Dáil inquiry, whatever type of committee inquiry. You produce a report with recommendations. Decisions are made. You produce an implementation plan. You execute, you monitor, and you account for it. And that's the way it works. In many cases, for example, the revenue commissioners, Board Namona, which is mentioned here, An Post at the moment is going through that process in a very steady, deliberate way, the court service, and then, of course, in the private sector. I've been involved in every modernisation and transformation of Guinness and Diageo since 1982, following that sequence. But in most cases, something goes wrong along the way. And we are not short of reports. God knows we're not short of reports. Diagnoses, investigations. You have the Kennedy report on industrial schools, the Kenny report on development land, annual reports from the Inspector of Mental Health Services, who last month said people are still living in conditions unfit for human habitation. Nor have we been short of money. So intelligent solutions have been restated and stated again and again and again. Donald the Butler is here, did comparison among a number of successive reports on taxation, reform of taxation. They're all saying the same thing. So we've been told what to do. We've been told what to do again and again and again. These are things we need to do, but we have failed to act. So we've got an implementation deficit disorder. So more analyses, more inquiries, more reports of the proceedings of Glenties are effectively futile unless we name and render discussable and effectively address the meta problem in every case. And this phrase was coined by Silda Langford, who was a psychologist working in the Department of Education. She said, we suffer from a pervasive chronic implementation deficit disorder, which I think is a very felicitous term for that. Now, how do we recognize implementation deficit disorder? Recently, Dermot Martin referred to implementation deficit disorder, not in those words. He talked about that there are dark forces at work who resist the emergence of the truth and the full implementation of the Church's child protection guidelines. Now, all you have to do is change the domain, change it to education, change it to the public service, change it to wherever you like, the judiciary. And what you have is a resistance, a determination not to have the truth emerge. All kinds of devices are used to that. And even if the truth does emerge, you have resistance to the full implementation of the remedial action. The presenting symptoms, to stick with the psychological metaphor of implementation deficit disorder, is a deeply embedded impulse within the culture of the old wineskins. It's a reflex. It's not deliberate in the sense they don't have to think about it. Just do it. To rationalize, deny, obfuscate, dismiss compelling evidence of failure and of the need for change. To disown any responsibility for what went wrong. It was Lehman's that caused it. Or in another domain, I recall John Carr saying about the public finances, we had no hand, act or part in this. To tenaciously maintain the status quo, to protect the interests of powerful stakeholders, we heard last week about bankers' emotional attachment to delinquent borrowers, and protect the institution by cover-ups, such as the bishops, and also to suggest that we put the past behind us and move on. Why don't we get a life? You know, stop moaning about the past. It's time to move on. Wah wah. And also, wonderfully, to propose that we are the best people to sort it out anyway. The wounded healer solution. Some people refer to Archbishop Cardinal Brady as the most suitable person to lead the Church in its implementation of the child protection guidelines because, in quotes, he's a wounded healer. And we have lots of wounded healers now on boards and on banks and other institutions in the Department of Finance and Civil Service, all wounded healers who are going to get us out of this. But I don't buy that. Now, who are the main carriers? This thing is contagious. So who are the main carriers of implementation deficit disorder? Organised groups with strong bargaining power, the Impact Trade Union in the HSE, hospital consultants, the legal profession, and you can add your own list. Senior civil servants, senior officials, senior managers, board members and others who have reached the top of their respective organisations. So the people who operate at the top of organisations, including many of you here present today. But you reach the top because you are competent, undoubtedly competent, but also, more importantly, much more important than competence, technical competence, you are unlikely ever to have questioned the prevailing culture, which is the sad regret of Bishop Jim Moriarty when he was stepping down. They reached the top because they were a good cultural fit. I've been on interview boards for senior positions many times, and that's the implicit question that's asked. Is this person a good cultural fit? A safe pair of hands, wouldn't knock the boat, and loyalty is the governing value. Loyalty rather than right and wrong. So, a bit more detail on how this dark forces frustrate reform. I'm not going to go through all of this because I want to get to some recommendations. I have some suggestions. First of all, there's often no inquiry needed anyway. A straight answer in the Dáil would have done something, which then takes 10 years to unravel and costs millions of pounds. Constrain the terms of reference. For example, let's eliminate September the 28th. Appoint a biddable person, a safe pair of hands, a tame judge, a recently retired civil servant who will do something that's safe for us. Report and recommendations. Sanitize before completion. I've been asked to tone stuff down. Use legal pretext to obscure. Have you ever seen a redacted report? Well, this is a redacted report. This is a redacted report. I have a whole chunk of pages here from a redacted report. That's a report published on the Mona Gear case, which is the sad story of the Dunn family down in Mona Gear. That's what you get when you get a redacted report. Okay? That's not acceptable to me in a republic. Shoot the messenger. I've been sued for reports I've written which told the truth. Get your interpretation in first. Albert Reynolds before the publication of the Beef Tribunal inquiry. Brian Cowan before the introduction of the last two finance reports. He had a week to rehearse it and get a 4,000-word speech. We even told him how many words was in the speech. Refused to publish it, sit on it. Recent report from Foss took 5 years to get out. Decisions, an Irish solution to an Irish problem, such as the central bank and the regulator. No coherent vision. It struck me last night. One of the things you have to hand it to Sinn Féin for, and I hand it to them, is they had a vision which supported them and helped them to sustain the effort. There is no vision. We have no vision of where we're trying to get to. So we've nothing to sacrifice for. No timelines. We will drain the Shannon. This here is Vision for Change, the government's policy on mental health. There's a monitoring report that has reported for the 4th year in a row that is not being implemented. No timelines on it. Execution, weak management. I'll tell you this, the Croke Park Agreement will never be implemented because there is weak management at middle, frontline and senior level. You need good management on the ground to implement industrial relations agreements. That's going to be the Achilles heel of it, and somebody has to address it. Monitor and control. You produce the plan with a Lagan Gaelic attached to the back of it, and you put it in the drawer. And finally, the spinal cord of accountability is not clear. I have spent a lot of time working in the HSE and still am. And I could not draw for you unequivocally the spinal cord of accountability, and nor could the Minister. Finally, my second last point there, I would ban the use of "it was a systems problem" from the conclusion to any report. If there is a systems problem, the question arises as who is responsible for the design, implementation, maintenance and monitoring of the system. So let's abandon that as a catch-all. We heard it again last week in relation to childcare. It's a systems problem. It isn't a systems problem. And finally, there are no consequences at the end, and I'll come back to that. So, in summary, we have enormous problems. I've likened it to, the problems in this country that Vincent alluded to earlier are comparable to a country that has been to war. The national coffers are empty. A whole generation of young people educated and reared will be lost. They're bringing in bulldozers to level what are basically bomb sites. And also people will die as a result of this. Largely we know what went wrong. The diagnosis is done. We don't need more inquiries. Who is responsible? We have a fair idea. And we kind of know what needs to be done, except for some of the big problems in the financial area. I can't say we are sure what we need to do. But we're stuck. So the reports pile up. When I got involved in the health system, I asked for some background reading. Could you send me a copy of the annual report, the strategy statements, and any other relevant reading? And a van arrived at my house, and two fellows got out and brought in 2 crates of reports. The Department of Health has commissioned 200 reports in the last 10 years from consultants and various others. So we're stuck. And we're stuck because the old wineskins who received these reports suffer from severe implementation deficit disorder. So another report won't do it. So how the hell do we get out of this predicament? Except, as Denis Foley might say, to hope against hope, trusting in the wounded healer to get us out of it. Well, I want to make a couple of suggestions which will take us beyond that. I have 6 recommendations, which I'll get through quickly. 5 of them are largely for government, a programme for government, but they apply to other institutions. And the last recommendation, I'm going to get personal and address it to you folks here. And I'm also going to offer some time frames. The first thing that social workers will tell you is that dysfunctional families need outside help. Well, we're a dysfunctional family, and lots of our institutions are dysfunctional families. Reform from within is possible. We've Gorbachev, John the 23rd, Whittaker, people like Finbar, Flood and Guinnesses. But reform from within closed systems is extremely difficult and almost impossible. And closed systems, briefly, there are lots of features to them, but one feature of them is the people at the top are lifers. And they've shown themselves capable of playing the game that you need to play to get to the top. So how do you break that? New blood and powerful new oversight structures are needed. One of the reasons you're getting some hope in the Catholic Church is the two people, Dermot Martin and Noel Traynor, have entered the scene. Neither have a career in the Irish Church. They're effectively outsiders. The RUC, I believe, is one of the textbook cases of institutional reform. Think about that. New CEOs from outside, new oversight structures in the form of Nuala O'Loan, and so on. Same with our own Garda Inspectorate, an ombudsman who have staffed by outside people, policemen like Kathleen O'Toole, policewomen from outside Ireland. HICWA has been the best thing that's happened in the health system. They've finally begun to jolt parts of the health system. They're holding up the mirror, holding it into account, and have real powers. Recently, the mental health, and by the way, HICWA is staffed by, headed by an English woman, and most of our staff are from outside Ireland. The Mental Health Commission, an Irish agency, all-Irish agency, have begun to exercise the powers that they have in relation to the health mental hospitals. Elderfield and Honohan, an external watchdog is needed. If we need outside help, we keep fearing loss of sovereignty. For God's sake, we've lost our sovereignty. Let's face up to it and let's get the bloody help that we need from outside, okay? We need independent reviews instead of self-serving internal reviews. Applied to the structure of government, what this means is, and I would strongly advocate, a dedicated cabinet ministry for reform, a new cabinet structure with new blood, because the Department of Finance, an old wineskin, is unlikely to drive reform, and it has made a bid to be given responsibility for reform. It cannot do it. And this department needs to have hand-picked internal and external staff, credible external advisory board, real power with a substantial budget to incentivise reform, named individuals responsible for major projects, and quarterly public reporting. That could be implemented in the next government. My second premise is that what's measured gets done. And the idea of a balanced scorecard is widely used in industry. And I'm proposing a statutory requirement to report annually on these 5 elements. Every year at budget time there is a set piece where the Minister for Finance, with his family in attendance, photographed outside in his best Sunday suit, gives us a report on the public finances, and we're told how GDP is, GNP is, per capita income, national debt, tax receipts. Essentially all they're doing is reporting on one of those axes, the one that's at the north there, at the top. But there is no annual report on the strengths and weaknesses of the wealth-creating engine, which is industry, the industry portfolio, innovation. Where are we on the value chain? Are we making widgets or designing widgets? The availability of credit, cost competitiveness, and so on. Now, I know that the National Competitiveness Council, for example, covers this, but it's in a separate report that appears at another time. We need to measure and report annually on infrastructure, broadband, transport, etc. And we then need to report on quality of life, social justice, income disparity, care of the vulnerable. Children dying at 1.5 per month in government care, for example. And, you know, there's a litany of problems there. People going around in mental hospitals in their pyjamas, sedated in locked rooms. So, and finally, we need the one in the middle badly. And that is an annual audit. We can figure out how it's going to be done, of whether or not we have an ethical, competent, accountable government and public service. That could be done. So, and I'd say this here too, I was looking back over, I wrote a version of this in the year 2000, and in the year 2000, John Fitzgerald and Brendan Walsh, UCD, John Fitzgerald and ESI, were advocating that we bring a halt to the gallop on the GNP, on the growth issue. And I have quotations here which I haven't time to go into, for example, saying we need to invest in quality of life. More recreational spaces, more investment in infrastructure, these other axes. What we've had is a one-dimensional view of what it means to be successful. And I came across the words that really capture this very well for me. I came across the words of Oliver Goldsmith on the cover of a book, which to me captures the sad story of Ireland in the last decade. Goldsmith says, "Ill fares the land to hastening ills a prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay." He was from Pallasmore in County Longford, and I also stumbled across, happily, a quotation from the Irish Times from Carl O'Brien, writing about what was described as Longford's most prestigious address 2 years ago. Houses abandoned, eerily quiet, almost like a post-apocalyptic scene from a science fiction movie. I can recall only a few years ago, we were told, I think it was by Mary Harney, that we are awash with money. The government had so much money it was giving it away in the form of SSIAs. We were the second most wealthy country in Europe. Where wealth accumulated, the whole bloody system was falling apart underneath the surface. That's why I recommend that the advantage of measuring and tracking all the key indices together at a similar event annually on a 2-day event, not just includes the budget, but that our formal reports on the other 4 axes. And let's call it something different than budget day. The third recommendation is strengthen the strategic centre. The strategic centre has to do with the capacity and capabilities at the heart of the public service. And I have a number of recommendations. Stop and reverse decentralisation where practically possible, because it has severely degraded the strategic centre. Decentralisation involved the appropriation and vandalisation of the civil service for party political gain, my civil service for party political gain, to try to gain seats in the local elections of 2003. And it has done huge damage to the capacity of the civil and public service, which has not been documented. Beef up the specialist and professional expertise, especially in policy-making departments. Gareth Fitzgerald has written about that. He told me that when he wrote criticising the Department of Finance for not having enough economists, they instituted proceedings against him to sue him. To beef up the specialists in many other departments. Fill a percentage of senior positions from outside. 81 of the 82 senior positions that came available in the last couple of years that were open to outside competition, 81 of them were filled internally, although there were 320 or 350 candidates from outside. Address the formation of senior public servants. I put that in red. It's not about training. It's not just about training and technical expertise. It's about character formation and the formation of a value system. My fourth recommendation is a comprehensive overhaul of the systems of truth and consequences. We played that game as kids. Behaviour is a function of consequences. The only reason that Bertie Ahern felt he could go before a tribunal, swear an oath and tell us he won the money on a horse was because he saw his predecessor do it. And the same thing has happened again and again. John Gilligan offered the same excuse last year in the court. And we heard Gareth's comments last night on Michael Lowry. If there are no consequences, well then this stuff will continue. So what can be done? The Ministers and Secretaries Act of 1924 needs to be reformed so that senior officials can publish the advice and can speak their minds before Dáil committees. They're gagged at the moment. Restore the Freedom of Information Act to its proper status, introduce a whistleblowers charter, develop instruments of inquiry that work, that don't take 10 years and millions of dollars, millions of euro. Restore the Equality Authority to its full strength. Strengthen regulators. Most of the institutions have shown themselves to be incapable of self-regulation. Let's stop kidding ourselves. Restore perjury as a crime. And finally, put in place laws which effectively deter white-collar crime. The director of the Office of Director and Corporate Enforcement last week said nobody has been convicted or sent to jail for a white-collar crime in Ireland in the last 10 years. So there are some of the recommendations. I now want to move on to culture. I have a collection of editorials and newspaper articles from the last 2 years which have reached for the construct culture to explain what has gone catastrophically wrong. We've had the culture of FÁS, the culture of bankers, the culture of builders, the culture of firms, the culture of the Catholic Church, the culture of a group of Gardaí in Donegal, the culture of medical consultants, the culture of Lourdes Hospital, the culture of the financial regulator, the culture. We need to stop and ask ourselves, what the hell is this thing called culture? Because by God, we have reached for it in order to explain catastrophic and continuing failure. So I'm developing, hoping to make a few bob out of this, a new board game, which is to match the culture. So below the line I have all the labels that have been attached to these cultures: cover-up and collusion, denial, deference, clericalism, arrogance, greed, violence, irresponsibility. And above the line I have the institutions to which these things were attached. So There's a prize for €100 at the end of the week for anybody who can match those up. But listen, seriously, I mean, you can add in the law library, last week described by the taxing master as proposing fees that were disgusting, revolting and bewildering. We have a problem with institutional culture. Now, in the work that I would do, we always address culture. Above the line, you have the technical challenge, structures, policies, etc. And I put in there just to illustrate. We have loads of rules. Child protection guidelines, what's called the Combined Corporate Code, standards and ethics in public office, rules from regulators. We have the law, we have the 10 Commandments, we have the Quran. Lots of structures. That's not where the problem is. And this week, I would suggest to you that when you propose new structures, try to also address the bit that's below the surface. Because new structures, new rules do not deliver the change you're looking at. Because below the surface, below the iceberg, if you like, is where the problem is. There's the mindset, the values, the lack of courage or the presence of courage, the purpose, and something Garrett mentioned last night, the maturity of the moral reasoning. So above the line is a technical challenge. Below the line, it's a cultural challenge and a challenge of character. And that's where implementation deficit disorder lies. I've thrown this in as well. In relation to next government, for example, we need new political leaders. We need political leaders with the values of a statesman. I mean, it's easier said than done. Above the line, what you have are all the new systems, which will be talked about this week. New voting systems, new list systems, and so on and so forth. So you have your new systems. They will not make a difference unless we can get somebody who has at least a smattering of the value of a statesman. The political values are the next election. The values of a statesman are the next generation. The Sinn Féin story is illuminating there. The political ethics are the ethics of being re-elected, as Bertie Ahern said, as opposed to doing what's right. The preoccupation is with the spoils of office, marks, half cars, as opposed to service. They play down to the weaknesses of their own tribe, promising them the impossible, as opposed to confronting the culture of their own tribe, and self-interest as against the interests of the nation. What are my recommendations in relation to culture? It is possible to make boards and senior executives in organizations engage with values and culture. I'm talking about boards taking a half day to discuss the values and how they're living them and not living them. They don't do it. I can tell you they don't do it. They think it's corny, think it's a waste of time. And at one big board meeting in one of the institutions that's failed, I heard the senior people say, the values are for the staff. Make a culture audit an integral part of strategic plans and annual reports. If it's so important, let's hear about it. And there's a huge project, a huge project, which I will describe as the reappropriation of the foundational values of the public service, which have been seriously degraded and eroded, to the great dismay of many decent people within the public service. Finally, clean up political funding. That could be done in the first week of government, the last one. The rest of it is a lifelong thing. And finally, I want to get personal, if you like. Call to arms, personal leadership for these times. You can apply 3 tests to anybody that you're calling to be a leader. One is, do you know what needs to be done? We know what needs to be done. The reports tell us we have them. Test of competence, if you don't have it, hire it. Buy it in. But the real challenge that we face today is not one of insight or competence. It's one of will, which is a test of character, and it is a moral challenge, an existential challenge for each one of us. It really is tragic, and it will move you to tears if you think about it, to hear Jim Moriarty say on his stepping down as Bishop of Loughlin and Kildare, on reflection, I should have questioned the prevailing culture of the time. Think of the consequences of his not speaking up at that time. More children abused, injustice to children who are still suffering the fact that they were not heard and so on. Just terrible. And in relation to Regling and Watson, no one in authority had the courage to shout stop. Now we have paid a truly awful price because no one in authority had the courage to shout stop. Garrett talked about it last night. No one had the guts to shout stop. Garrett, to give us credit, did have the courage to shout stop but he was somehow ignored. I was showing this to a friend last week, the paper here. Sean Brophy is a very good friend of mine, and he reminded me of the Kitty Genovese case. In front of 38 witnesses, Kitty Genovese was murdered on the streets of Queens, New York in 1965. The witnesses stood around and did nothing to prevent her death, and a book was written about this afterwards, in which each one effectively rationalized, "Oh, someone ought to have done something about it, but I didn't feel it was up to me." Elaine Byrne said last week in the Irish Times, "It's easier and safer to avoid and ignore than to acknowledge and confront." The response to my articles in the Irish Times was twofold. First of all, a sense of relief, palpable relief, that at last, as someone said it to me, at last someone has said what needed to be said for a long time. People as if were waiting for someone to say it. And a second response was fear for my well-being. Sean O'Rourke asked me on the news at 1, "Were your articles criticising the Department of Finance a suicide note regarding your career as a management consultant?" So what are the implications for you? You present here at this conference, and people who will read about this conference, represent the elite of Irish society. No question about it. Most of you hold or have held high office. All of you are influential. You've been faced many times with hard choices in the past, but we are now in a very acute situation where you're called on for something else. You're each facing a moment of truth to demonstrate either courage in action or to hang in there with the Kitty Genovese crowd and say, "It's not up to me, and it's not up to me, not now, Lord, not now." There is here an existential challenge for each one of us in these difficult times. And to conclude, the heroes of 1916 showed courage in action by taking up a gun and going to the GPO and spilling their blood and going to jail. What will define the heroes of 2016? What will define heroism today, where we stand facing the crisis that we face? And where will they gather in 2016? And will you be among them or not? So my recommendations regarding personal leadership are, it's your call, folks. And the best time frame is on the beach tomorrow morning when you're going for a walk or going for a swim. And I did say this was a sermon. So to conclude my sermon, I want you to go forth in peace, to love and serve your country. Thanks.